Today we know more details than ever about some of the men held at the U.S. terror detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Citing previously secret documents obtained by WikiLeaks, today's New York Times tells the story of one detainee who was subjected to harsh interrogation techniques but whose, quote, confessions appear true. Another man, released in 2004, went on to plan an attack that killed 31 people. He died a suicide bomber. These latest leaks give us a lot to discuss. Joining us from New York is Dafna Linzer, a senior reporter at ProPublica, who has extensively reported on Gitmo. And here with me in Washington, CNN national security contributor Fran Townsend. She's a member of both the Department of Homeland Security and the CIA External Advisory Boards. We'll get into the details in just a minute, but first a debate about whether it is good or bad, good or potentially harmful, that these documents and these details are made public. You think, Fran, there's some risk. Is somebody watching at home, is it possible that the terrorists can learn so much from seeing these documents that somebody at home is less safe?
Well, John, the problem with this is twofold. One, we know that al-Qaeda develops counterinterrogation techniques, and part of the way you do that is to look at the kinds of questions, the kind of areas that the government is asking about. And so that's one harm in it. The second is, I believe that these cables are like taking a snapshot of a movie. People told us a lot of things, much of which was not true, much of which was used in interrogations of other people. And so you can't really tell just by the release of it what's important and what's not, what was true and what was useful.
But Daphne, you have reviewed these recently, the newly released documents. You've also spent a lot of time, more than anybody I know, in the court files of some of these cases and some of these proceedings that are making their way through. Do you see the risk as high as Fran puts it?
I understand what Fran is saying. Some of this information we've known for a long time. Some of it was released through Freedom of Information Act lawsuits and became public years ago. Transcripts of detainee trials and hearings that took place in Guantanamo years ago, and again through court filings have been made public. I think what Fran, I think she has her larger point about, some of the raw intelligence sort of not accompanying a narrative. A lot of this information was discarded. A lot of this information turned out to be wrong. And a lot of it, was just not that important even for the Bush administration. People who were deemed high risk were still let go because at the end of the day, the White House believed that was the right decision. So I don't think that they took into account, the high-risk factor in a way that would necessarily appear that case just from looking at the documents themselves. Well,
what have we learned, I think, is a big question. September 11th is almost 10 years ago now. The Gitmo facility has been in place for most of that time. As obviously, you understand, in the early days, it was emergency, pulling people off the battlefield. You can understand the chaos in the early days. But what about now? Is there a good system in place to rate and rank these people, to decide who is a greater threat? And I want to cite a few examples. One is this from the story in the New York Times today. A Pakistani militant, Mohammed Alam-Shah, was sent back to Afghanistan. He revealed himself to be Abdullah Mashoud. He recorded jihadist videos, organized a Taliban force to fight American troops, planned an attack on Pakistan's interior ministry that killed 31 people, oversaw the kidnapping of 2 Chinese engineers, finally detonated a suicide bomb in 2007 as the Pakistani army closed in. So, Fran, there's one example where somebody was released who clearly should have been held. Is there a good assessment system?
Well, it's very difficult, John. And when you look at the statistics of the numbers released and then returned to the battlefield during the Bush administration, I think you better understand then when you look at the statistics from the Obama administration. They've been very reticent about who they return, who they release, because we find there is a recidivism rate. It's very difficult, just as it is in American prisons, it's very difficult to predict who will return.
And yet, Daphne, the same piece in the New York Times goes on to say, for every case of an Abdullah Mashoud, someone wrongly judged a minimal threat. There are several instances in which prisoners rated high risk were released and have not engaged in wrongdoing. Again, is somebody who is either taken into custody today or being detained today, are they being assessed in a way that is more reality-based, say, than perhaps 6 or 7 years ago in the initial chaos?
Right. Well, those files that were released today, the Obama administration basically discarded. When they came in, they set up a new process. They did their own review, and their internal review remains classified. We haven't seen those files, and it would be very interesting to compare those files to the originals. But as Fran said, they have been very, very reticent. And indeed, there are lots of people who are being held that the Obama administration has said they would like to release. They are not releasing them either because of congressional restraints or because of problems in Yemen. But there's a lot of people they would let go if they could.
You mentioned the problems in Yemen. Let me go over here. I want to show our viewers just a little bit of history and what has happened here. If you go back to 2003, this is the population at Guantanamo Bay. just shy of 700 detainees. You see Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Yemen, others in dual citizenship. And by that point, 42 had been transferred. Now, if you come forward to 2011, you see most, 600 have been transferred, 172 detainees held. And Fran Townsend, I know you have particular concern right here. If you look at those still held, especially if you compare it to the previous, a lot of Yemenis still held here, a lot of uncertainty about the leadership in Yemen right now. If you were the Obama administration and somebody here was 50-50, even 70-30 on the scale of, well, let's take a chance and release them, send them home, would you do it?
No. I mean, listen, President Saleh of Yemen was not a particularly reliable partner during the Bush administration, and it's worse now. I mean, remember, during the Bush administration, you had a number of al-Qaeda members who were in custody who escaped 50 at a time while under Yemeni police custody. Given now the unrest there, given that al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has been judged by both Mike Leiter, the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, John Brennan, the president's CT advisor, as being the greatest threat to U.S. citizens here at home, I don't think you can send anybody reliably back to Yemen and expect them to hold them.
Dafna, as someone who has spent years looking at these issues, now that these new documents have been spilled out over the past 48 hours or so, what do you know today that you didn't know a week ago?
What do you know? You know a few things. You know that mostly a lot of these assessments that were created were simply not relied on by people in the Bush administration, not relied on by people in the Obama administration. Some of the evidence that has been presented in courtrooms has been discarded, has been found to be unreliable. A lot of these detainees have gone home, and a lot of these detainees spent a lot of time in Guantanamo and have not caused harm since they've been released, which I think is a big issue. I think one other issue is that, you know, will countries who did agree to take in other detainees continue to do that, or will allies who accepted detainees now have regrets because of the way these documents look today?
Excellent points. Dafna Linzer, Fran Townsend, appreciate you both helping sort out. It's a very controversial and complicated subject. Appreciate it.